You're listening to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. Season ticket holders and lifelong fans with neighborhood ties discuss Cubs news and neighborhood happenings. Here's your hosts, Jeremy and Pat.
Hello and welcome to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. This is episode 269 of the podcast. My name is Jeremy Deemer and I'll be your host. I'm joined as always by my co-host. He's my cousin. He's high atop Wrigleyville tonight. How's it going, Pat?
It is a rainy, stormy night, but no baseball games to be postponed on the north side today, so otherwise it's fine.
Yeah, no baseball on the north side. Well, since last we podcasted, the season had ended. And we took a week between the end of the season and now. We let Jed Hoyer do his post-season press conference. And we're going to bring on Jared Willis here in a few minutes to help us go through just the whole season. Let's unpack this whole thing. Let's get some closure. Let's put a bow on it and call it a season. It was it was just rough. Cubs finished with a 71-91 record, which is unbelievable if you think about how good the team was halfway through the season.
Yeah, that's the hardest part, really, to take. It's not necessarily the final result. A bad season's a bad season, but to think that in late June the Cubs were in first place, and then went on, as we know, an epic 11-game losing streak, followed by selling off like a third of the team's roster, all of whom seem to be doing pretty well in the postseason, I might add. But it was a tale of two seasons, that's for sure.
It was. We will go through both of the seasons here. We'll talk about them at length. But it's funny you mentioned previous Cubs in the postseason. Players who were Cubs in the last calendar year, who are in the playoffs this year. It was John Lester with the Cardinals, Kyle Schwarber with the Red Sox, Jock Peterson with the Braves, Craig Kimbrell and Ryan Tepera with the White Sox, Anthony Rizzo with the Yankees. This one always hurts. Chris Bryant with the Giants, and Colin Ray with the Milwaukee Brewers.
Don't forget Tommy La Stella, but I don't know if
it wasn't in this calendar year. It wasn't. Yeah,
that's true. Yeah, that's true.
But
that's a lot of players. A lot of players who are performing well, I might add.
Yeah, I think the Giants are my rooting interest right now in the National League because I'm rooting for Chris Bryant.
The lesser of all evils.
Yes, and yes. Chris Bryant to have success. And, he's already hit a home run. He's had a big game already against the Dodgers. This is exciting. So I'm rooting for the success of Chris Bryant, which means the success of the San Francisco Giants.
Thankfully, there are no recent ex-Cubs on the Brewers because it's much easier now to root for the Braves. I don't know if you saw that as we're recording this right now, no one's been eliminated, although the Rays are getting close and the Brewers are getting close and the White Sox are getting close, but nobody has been yet. And I have to say, this is probably the worst time of the year, baseball-wise, I think, at least for me, because you've got teams that have played so well for so long, all season. And then this is that awkward kind of comeuppance that teams get in a 5-game series where the whole season just kind of ends. You can win 90, 97 games, 100 and some games in the case of the Dodgers and the Giants. But this is when people start getting eliminated. And it just feels in baseball after a 162-game season that a 5-game playoff always feels like such a short, painful window for one of the teams.
Yeah, this season especially really shined the light on the need to, I believe you should reseed after that wild card game, right? Like if you're the Giants and you win 107 games, you shouldn't have to play the team that won 106 games. You should play the worst team.
Right. Absolutely.
But enough talk about the playoffs, let's bring on our guest, Jared Willis, joining us for the final time this season to help us recap the season that was. The tale of two seasons in one. We will discuss it at length here. Jared, thanks for taking time out to wrap up the season with us.
Absolutely. Good to be talking baseball with you guys, even under the strange circumstances that have been the 2021 season.
Yeah, if we go back to the beginning, we go all the way back to the offseason when the Cubs traded Cy Young runner-up, the guy who really had come into just hitting his stride as a Cubs ace, trading of Yu Darvish and Victor Caratini to the San Diego Padres, setting the tone for what would be the entire season of this is about cutting payroll and good luck to you. And
trading them for children for the most part.
Basically, yeah.
That was like I remember thinking it then in December that okay, so 2021 is going to be a non-competitive season.
Yep.
And had I held on to that thought, I think things would have felt a lot different. But the problem was the Cubs did this thing in June where they got into first place, and again, should have held on to the thought that I had back in December and just said, don't buy into this, don't fall into it. And yet, they get to first place. They throw this combined no-hitter. Things are looking, hey, we're in for a much different season. And then
this was on June 24th, by the way, not the beginning of June, but late June when the Cubs were 9 games over 500 coming off that no-hitter.
Yeah, and you're pretty deep into the season where you can say like, oh, okay, maybe this is for real. Maybe this is legit. It's not like when your team comes out of the gate real hot in April and everybody gets all excited and then, we return to normal. I mean, this was, you're 65, 70 games into the season. Things, but I think symbolically the 11-game losing streak was just like the, lest we all be tempted to think that things were ever going to turn out any differently, we're going to go ahead and lose 11 straight games just to cement the reality that, no, this is not a competitive season. They are going to trade people. This was always going to happen, and we should never have thought otherwise.
Even the losing streak, though, felt like it was inevitable given the fact that in the offseason, in addition to ridding themselves of the Cy Young runner-up, and Kyle Schwarber, mind you.
Oh, that's right. For $2 million to save $2 million, Kyle Schwarber and John Lester could not be brought back to this team.
But the other thing they did, though, that was somewhat insidious is that they basically decided they were too cheap to have a backup catcher, and they were too cheap to have at least one more starting pitcher in their rotation. I mean, they really went on the cheap in those areas.
And they went with the strategy of all the backup catchers instead of one.
All the backup catchers and all the seventh starters, right? But when you do that, you are asking to fall out of contention. And frankly, the only thing keeping the Cubs in contention for as long as they were some surprisingly solid seasons out of primarily members of the bullpen, but just, guys coming up from the minors, older people who, were having bounce back seasons. Craig Kimbrell, with his reemergence as an ace closer, lockdown closer, those things held the Cubs, in the race until it just couldn't anymore, right? Like if you had just spent, like Jeremy says, if you just spent $10 million more in the off season, this team probably gets to the All-Star break, if not in first place, then really close to first place. But that's not what the owners really wanted, is it? They wanted to fall out of contention because that would make it easier to then unload all of the players who are on contracts that were expiring. And it's hard to do that when you're in first place. I'm sure they were sweating bullets there, but it's a lot easier to do it, when you're falling farther and farther behind.
Yeah, no one was more relieved when they started that losing streak than Cubs ownership, because then it justified what they had planned to do all along anyway. It just took away, the awkward scenario where, as a first place team, you are still trading away key roster pieces. Which, again, had we all paused for a minute and thought, hold on, these guys traded Yu Darvish and Victor Caratini back in December. Clearly, they were never going into this season expecting to contend. They're just as surprised to see this team in first place as we all are. And so, I mean, they really kind of saved them there by going off on that losing streak at the end of June into early July. That, and I remember when Jed Hoyer spoke right after that losing streak had finally ended, and saying, "Oh, life comes at you fast," and all that kind of stuff. And, in the moment, it was like, oh, yeah, I guess that losing streak really did turn the tide of the season. But now, having had the time to reflect on it a little bit, it's more like, no, it just gave them an easy story for why they were trading these guys, when in fact, I know I keep saying this, but when in fact that was their plan all along.
It gave them the permission structure to tank the rest of the season.
Yeah.
It did. I mean, but to your point,
an easy way to explain it. Yeah.
Yeah, to your point, Jared, it was the plan all along. Remember when, I know this podcast, we were screaming that, hey, there's a second base need. Colton Wong is available, and he's pretty cheap.
Mm-hmm.
It sure would be great if they went out and got that guy, and instead we get Eric Sogard. So it was there were red flags all along the way. We didn't want, but the good start that they had, the absolute reemergence of Chris Bryant as a guy who could carry a team through his beginning of the season. It was fun. It was a great time watching these guys not go quietly until that 11-game losing streak. But then when it did come time to get to the trade deadline, we knew we did plenty of shows where we were looking at making predictions on speculation on what would happen at the trade deadline. And we all pretty much figured that the bullpen was gone. We figured that maybe Zach Davies was gone. And one of the core, your Baez, Rizzo, Bryant, well, at least one of those players were gone. I think everybody was surprised when all three of the bats went, and what a couple of weeks that was. Seeing the clips of the guys being emotional about leaving Chicago. This was a trade deadline that hopefully we don't have an experience like that anytime soon again. It was hopefully
pretty embarrassing for a big market team.
Absolutely.
Because that's the only thing that surprised me at all, at the end of the day, was that they traded all three of those guys. I was pretty convinced that they were going to trade two and find some way to keep one of them, and then that was going to be the sort of the feeling of like, okay, this isn't a full rebuild, we're not fully trying to tank here, we're just making these trades so that we can make an extension with this guy, say it's Javi Baez or whoever. But when they traded all three, that was just like a completely like, we have no interest in a future as an organization that involves any of these three people. And, say what we will about the possibility that they might return to Chicago over the winter, but that's never a guarantee. You can think that might work out, but you don't know that it will. I think you could look at the Boston Red Sox and what happened with John Lester. They, if memory serves me correctly, they traded him to Oakland at the trade deadline that year in 2014, thinking that they were going to be able to re-sign him to come back to the Red Sox that winter, but instead he ends up in Chicago with the Cubs. So, there's just no guarantee that that's what's going to work out, assuming that that's even the plan for any of those guys.
Yeah, you're being very generous.
Yeah, right. Like I'm making that assumption. I could be totally wrong. Maybe they're just like, you know what? Thanks for everything. We're going to trade you away, and that's that. And they're sort of washing their hands of all three of them.
I watch a team like the Los Angeles Dodgers who are, they let guys walk that you could consider being part of their core because they've been developing good new young players behind those core guys to come up and take those spots. And so they never have to completely rebuild. They are retooling in that way, like a major market team would do.
And when they need to, they'll get a Mookie Betts or a Trey Turner. They'll get an all-star.
Then
to help out, too.
then they add the big piece, right? Then they add the big piece, but they've been developing players along the way. I feel like this team traded away the core while having that next generation of players still a couple years away at best, which doesn't seem like it. It seems like, I don't know, that maybe they wanted to do this a year or so ago. I don't know. It was to tear it down again is just it's something a big market team shouldn't do.
Yeah, they shouldn't need to. And this time it feels a little different too because, I think when they were tearing it down, almost a decade ago, we had somewhat of an idea of like who some of those core guys were going to be, or that idea became more clear, over the course of a couple of years as they were doing those like first round draft picks, and you're drafting the Chris Bryants and the Kyle Schwarbers while already having Javi Baez in the system and some of those players. And so there was a clear vision around 2013, 2014 of like who it was from within that was going to come up and help the team win.
Yeah, and compounding, or I guess in addition to that, staying on that point, they also were trading away the Matt Garzas of the world. Not exactly, household Cubs names that had led them to any World Series championships either. Right. So they actually had a plan, and the people they were trading were not people who are held and adored by Cubs fans, forever.
Right. Guys that we knew from the beginning. I don't think anybody back then, Matt Garza's a great example. No one was getting attached to him back then, unlike what we have now. So seeing those guys get traded away was just like, yes, this is a natural part of this progression that we're on. This is a part of this plan. And this is just so much different because it's the guys who were the core pieces and guys who, for a couple of them at least, you thought maybe could be a part of the next round of, championship caliber teams. And then meanwhile, I don't follow the minor league system quite as closely as I did probably 7 or 8 years ago, but I still keep an eye on it. And I don't know that there's the same level of hype for this system, the same level, quantity of like high quality players who can come up and really be impact guys.
There's like
compared
one
to where we were.
Right? I mean,
yeah, like,
really? There's one.
We're talking about like Brendan Davis.
Yeah, that's the one.
And anybody else? Yeah,
No.
I don't know, because some of the other guys, like, they're too far away
They're
still.
too
Like
far
you said
away.
earlier, they traded for guys who aren't even old enough to vote yet. So,
and let's not
you
forget
can't even...
the last. Sorry, I was just going to say the last Cubs run of players included a ton of players who never made it anywhere, right? Who just kind of disappeared, the Junior Lakes of the world and Alcantara and all those other guys, right? So, for every like 7 guys who you think are going to be really good, one probably will, and one won't be on your major league team for an extended period of time. The other 5 are going to just disappear. So, yeah, you're right. It's not the same system.
Because you need that quantity. And so, yeah, like Brendan Davis is exciting right now, but you need like 5 guys who you have that level of possibility for, because probably one of them is going to work out.
And so after the trade deadline, we got through the emotional breakup of the Cubs team, and we saw some of our favorites go on to other teams. The rest of the season, first we took a beat and we said, hey, there was some good, at least they did some good baseball things here. We talked to a bunch of the prospect guys, and they all came on this podcast and told us that, we should be excited about a few of the guys they got. So that
2028 is going to be a really
big year. Get your season. Yeah, plenty of good seats available until then. We'll get to that in a minute. But we've got the rest of the season. It's us as Cubs fans grasping at things of interest to carry us there, because we're not watching the development of a lot of players who are going to be part of the next core. We're watching a group of 30-year-old rookies, Patrick Wisdom, Frank Schwindel. I'm looking at, I was looking at an email from James Clanny. Rafael Ortega, yes. James Clanny, listener of the show, sent us an email about some of his most odd moments is that we had Patrick Wisdom, who's older than Chris Bryant was, breaking Chris Bryant's rookie home run record as a 30-year-old. Super weird. And then you have Frank Schwindel having a better OPS than Sammy Sosa did in 1998. Just weird things to carry us through the second half of the season. But now that the season's over, let's be clear. We should not get attached to 30-year-old rookies as part of the next core. If these guys are an important part of this team next year, then we've seen a pretty rough off season.
Oh, yeah, without a doubt. And I think, there was a moment when Schwindel was named, I think, the August Rookie of the Month. I was, standing, near the dugout during Cubs batting practice, talking to another writer, and one of the Cubs players approached us. I won't say which one, just because I don't know that he would want me putting that out there. But he came up to us and he said, all right, I need you guys to answer this for me. When's the last time a team had two 30-year-olds win Rookie of the Month in the same season? And so when even the guys on the team are like, yeah, this is weird, that's, that probably tells you all you need to know.
Well, and Schwindel won Rookie of the Month every month that he played.
Right. Yeah.
He won it for August, September, and October. So, you don't see that very often. Not even Ichiro did that.
Yeah. And and I've had a lot of conversations with people who will ask me, like, okay, so who do you think's on the team next year? Which of these guys is sticking around? And they're asking about like the Wisdoms and the Schwindels, and I'm like, should we care?
Right. That's it.
Maybe they will be, but like, what does it matter? This is going to be a 70-win team, so who cares?
The Cubs, I think, in fairness to them, have developed a very good bench. Now they just need the starters, right? Because all the guys that you mentioned would be great, like I mentioned Rafael Ortega, a great platoon hitter, right?
Absolutely.
Not a great platoon hitter, but let's face it, like a 30-year-old platoon hitter who you could get away with having as long as you made sure that he basically only played against right-handed pitchers, right? And you've got Schwindel, who could probably be a starter for a while on a team that was otherwise good. And you've got Wisdom, who's probably more of a bench guy, I'm guessing. And all those guys could contribute to a good team, but you need the good team part. They aren't the good team part. They're the guys who, like the Cardinals always have, they're the guys that fill in and around Arenado and Goldschmidt and those guys, like the guys who just kind of fill in the seams there and deepen your roster. They're not the guys who make your roster, though, who make your team a good team.
No, because like Wisdom is the kind of guy who I want available to come off the bench and pinch hit late in the game.
Yep. Hit a home run.
Right. He might strike out, but he also might hit a home run. So he's perfect for that kind of thing. Or when your Chris Bryant needs a day off, he'll slot into third base and do just fine and give you, a couple of decent at-bats during the game too. He's 100% a role player. So you try to extend him. That's a reason why he's 30 years old and just making his rookie season. If it was any different, another team would have figured that out years ago. You know, how many examples do we have guys that really truly, don't blossom until they're 30? It just doesn't happen.
And if this team had a good left fielder and a good right fielder, Ortega and Happ combined, they could hold down center field. The fact is, though, the Cubs don't have a left fielder or a right fielder really at all. So it really doesn't matter who platoons in center field. I mean, that's the sort of the depressing part, is that you can't rely on these guys to be the guys that are going to carry you.
No, no, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, you mentioned Happ, and he's another good example of like maybe a step above a role player, because we see what can happen with him, like he did in the last couple of months of this season, where he just gets like crazy hot. But he's also shown that, in years past, where he's going to have super hot stretches, but also like can be really bad for stretches too. So he's another great example of like, should this be an everyday guy on your team? Probably not. Instead, it's somebody I like to keep around because he can handle multiple outfield positions. You could even bring him in and play second base if you really needed him to. And if he gets into a hot stretch, you can ride him for a few weeks. But yeah, anything beyond that, it just doesn't, it doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, they've got a lot of these 300 to 400 at bat type of guys, right?
Yeah.
Depending on how they're doing that year, the Schwindells, the Ortegas, the Happs. Any of these guys could play maybe half the time or a little bit more than half the time and contribute and still, and have the team be good. But when you ask them to do more than that, it gets harder because they do have the cold stretches and they do have, like Wisdom demonstrated, some holes in their swing, or Ortega against lefties or whatever. They have these, like, there are reasons, as you pointed, I think you alluded to, really, there are reasons why they didn't make it in the big leagues when they were 25 or 26, right? It's because they have these, like, sort of like fatal flaws when projected over a full season, as opposed to when used sort of in spots correctly.
Yeah, and remember that opponents don't have a book on these guys yet, because why bother? And so,
because our pitching pretty much prevented us from winning any games last 2 months.
Right.
It's a whole other story.
So yeah, the season ends 91 losses, which at the top of the show, Jared, we were mentioning, to lose 91 after being in first place late in June. That's a rough back half of a schedule there. That is a rough finish.
That's a feat right there.
29 games under 500 in your last 86 games or whatever. That's pretty bad.
So,
yeah, I mean,
it had to be rough. I know you were there for a lot of those games down the stretch there too, Jared.
Right.
So, how was it as rough for everyone involved as it was for the fans watching? The fans that were left. I mean, Pat, there were plenty of games that you and I were at where there were a lot of people dressed as seats. There was just it was pretty empty, and StubHub prices were at lows that we haven't seen in since 2012.
Well, because you can say anything you want about that 11-game losing streak in June, but you forget that wasn't even the longest losing streak of the season. That was in August, where they lost 12 in a row. It was a rough. It was a rough finish. I mean, they lost 13 out of 14 at one point. They lost 12 in a row at one point. They lost 11 in a row at one point. Those are some long, dreadful stretches. And fortunately, Jared, you were there to report on a bunch of those. I'm sure it was fun. But I imagine you don't want to have to do that again.
No. I can say 100% it is way more fun to cover a winning team. It's just, and that, like, the old cliches that, baseball writers don't root for any one team to win is true. Like, you're objectively, you're not necessarily interested in a specific outcome of any given game, but at the same time, if you're going to cover a team over the course of a whole season or multiple seasons, you do want to cover a winner because it's more fun. It gets hard to watch when you're going there day after day and the team's just bad, and it's not because it's bad baseball to watch. There's nothing exciting that you see, and that's a lot of what the second half of the season was. I mean, there were some fun storylines in there that I got to touch on, like Frank Schwindel had that, I think it was 3-4 games in a row where he conjured up some late inning magic to help them win. There were multiple walk-off hits in a series there. So some of those little pockets of things were fun. But it, really by like the second week of July, I remember thinking like, well, even when they do win, it doesn't really count for anything at this point. And so it definitely makes the home stretch of the season just really starts to feel longer. And I got to a point where I was like, I'm ready to be done coming here and watching this team. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and the good news is Sun Times sent you to the South Side a few times. And
yes, that was my reprieve for a little while. Yeah. We'll see how that works out, but yeah.
Watching the Cubs in the second half, we talked about some of the bright spots on the offense, and they really were bright spots. Like I feel great for Schwindel and for Wisdom and Ortega and all the guys, Ian Happ, who were able to put together a run there. Good for them. But what I guess was most disappointing, although predicted on this show before the trade deadline, was the absolute collapse of the pitching staff. Ugh, that was pretty awful and pretty hard to watch. There were very few pitchers on this staff that ended up relatively unscathed from what was a blistering bad August and September ERA-wise, for sure.
Yeah, Kyle Hendricks had to be the surprise of that bunch. I mean, just to watch how much he struggled this season. Yeah, just you got to hope that this is a 1 year thing, and you're not looking. You're looking at Kyle Hendricks bouncing back next year. You can't have Kyle Hendricks have a performance like this again next year and think you're going to be competitive.
Well, there was something interesting about that, and I wrote about it at the time. But, it was, I think it was Hoyer, if I remember correctly. No, it was Tommy Hotovy, who we asked him about Hendricks, like, hey, what's been up with Hendricks this season? Because this was like close to the end of the season. I think it was Hendricks had one start left at that point. And Hotovy said, like, he's never had a year that he's pitched where he wasn't competing for something, whether it's, he's pitching knowing that the team's likely headed for the playoffs, or he's pitching to try to get a contract extension. 2021 was the first time that Kyle Hendricks is facing, pitching in a non-competitive season. And it was kind of like, hey, this mentally, at least, it's affected him. And he's searching for different ways to get motivated. As strange as that might sound, you don't expect that, all the time. But it sounds like it really impacted him just mentally. And so some of what we saw this year could be a product of this guy's not used to pitching for bad baseball teams, and he's got to figure out how to handle that in the years to come.
Well, let's hope not.
Yeah, right.
The better solution is that they're not bad anymore, and he doesn't have to deal with this.
But, if that was going to be an issue, right, then they should have traded him too. Frankly, I mean, he's only got 2 years left, so that's the other thing. If they don't plan on competing in the next 2 years, what's the point of having him around, other than the fact that he's destroyed his trade value probably in the last couple months? But
and who knows? That could be because he wasn't as bad in the first half, but he wasn't particularly great, and maybe they did want to trade him, and it just, no offers came along that they felt good about, and it just didn't happen. Who knows? Yeah.
So let's talk about the path to good. How does this team get good in the off season? Now, I want to put a giant asterisk next to everything we say here, because this will be pending labor negotiations. We believe a work stoppage is imminent, and it will obviously impact everything we're talking about for the offseason. However, in a world where there's a normal offseason, going into an offseason where the Cubs in 2018 promised to spend money and didn't, 2019 promised to spend money and didn't, after 2020 said, hey, COVID, we've got no money. And now here we are going into the 2022 season, the Cubs the ownership hasn't really given us a lot of trust that they're going to spend money. Now, Jed Hoyer in his postseason press conference said that, quote, "We have money to spend this winter, but it's really important that we do that in an intelligent way."
You know what that sounds like? That sounds like 1 year, $7 million deals to me. That doesn't sound like going after, franchise players.
Yeah, so I guess that's my question, Jared. Does it sound like it to you that paying for top players is that the intelligent way, or are we in for another? Hey, we're not going to be competitive, so let's find the Jock Petersons for 1 year deals and flip them.
This is like, when you're a kid and your parents, a few weeks before Christmas start telling you that, like, well, Santa, the elves are, having a hard winter this winter, and we might, the elves might not be able to come through in the same, they're setting you up for with saying it without saying it. That's a lot with this.
I used to call BS on my parents and say, we're a big market team. Come on. Pony up.
Yeah, come on. So yeah, on one hand, like, realistically, he's pretty much spelled out, like, this is what he's going to do. And so don't get your hopes up, but let's pretend that that's not what's going to happen. Obviously the number one thing is, like, starting pitching. We've got some of these young arms like Justin Steele, Keegan Thompson, Edward Alzolay, even though he's sort of going to be entering his fourth major league season. So there's a point where, is he a starter? Would he be better out of the bullpen? We'll have to see. But you don't want to build a rotation with too many of those guys who are taking up spots. And so starting pitching is the number one, because if you can't do that, then just who cares about the rest of it? Because from there I would get into things like, you try to go get a power hitting shortstop, and look at maybe shifting Nico Horner into the outfield or something along those lines. But I'm not even interested in that if they're not going to bother with starting pitching, because if they don't, then there's really no point. So yeah, that's number one.
And you're in agreement with Jed, because in that same press conference he said, quote, "We need to dramatically improve our pitching," called it the number one priority and the downfall of this season for the Cubs, which, it was obviously a surprise to him, seeing that he was the one who traded a Cy Young finalist for Zach Davies. So
right.
While he gets
he says these things with a straight face,
it's hard.
I mean, it's not that hard. It's Marcus Stroman and one of the four shortstops, right? I mean, that's
Marcus Stroman and a Correa or a Baez
or Story or Baez, any of the shortstops, right? One of the Seager, one of the big four shortstops, and there are four of them, and there are good rich teams that don't need one. So that's even better, right? Like the Dodgers will probably just move Trey Turner over to short, so that they'll be out of the market. The Padres don't need one. There are a lot of teams that don't need them, so there are four available. You get one of those, you get Stroman. I mean, if you have to settle for Robbie Ray, that's fine too, I suppose. But you get a Stroman, and then you have to get another pitcher who you can at least count on to be, I mean, some people say no, Syndergaard or whatever. I don't know, but somebody who you hope can be like a number 3 starter on your team, because you just can't go into the season with as many question marks and holes in your starting rotation as they have had this past season. It's untenable, especially with injuries and other things that happen. You absolutely have to really stock up there. And then the Keegan Thompsons and Justin Steeles of the world and the Alzolays, that's all great, but that's all sort of like, filler, for something that already exists, as opposed to the guys that you're relying on, to be the guys. And maybe Marquez or somebody, he's able to throw a pitch to home plate and and quickly ascends to the majors. You never know, but you got to get some actual veteran help here because this is ridiculous otherwise.
Yeah, because the Steels and the Thompsons, those are kind of akin to what we were talking about earlier in a different way, but like with Schwindel and Wisdom, where those guys are fine to have as fillers, or you need a spot start, you need somebody who can come in and give you some long relief, maybe pitch 2-3 innings in relief. They're great for stuff like that at this point in their careers. But yeah, if you're trying to give them 150 innings, you're in a real bad place, rotation wise. And again, that's why. And it doesn't I love the idea of like Stroman, Robbie Ray, somebody like that. Like you can really make a big difference for your team just by doing that, and then going from there. It's those are like 2 spots on the roster. Go get Marcus Stroman, get Carlos Correa or Trevor Story, and you're instantly quite a bit better, than where they are right now.
And then all those other guys actually do make a difference, and can be helpful.
Right.
But you can't have. I mean, they're serviceable and they're helpful, but you can't have a situation like they have right now where you look at the ERAs of their pitching staff right now. I mean, with Hendricks leading the way at 4.77, Zach Davies at 5.78, Mills at 5.07. Of course, Arrieta was at the 6.80s. Even Alzolay was 4.58. I mean, those are some brutal numbers. And then you look at the innings pitched by a lot of these guys. That was another thing this season that really sort of, we've grown accustomed over the last 5 or 6 years to the Cubs going deeper in games as starting pitchers and logging more innings. But this year was really hard. And apparently, when your starters are going 3 or 4 innings a game, it might tax your bullpen, apparently, because that was certainly the case for us this year.
Yeah, it turns out that has an effect over time.
Yeah, right? Who knew?
All right, so it sounds like the good news is there's a path to good. The bad news is it's going to cost some money. It's trust with this ownership that we'll have to see if the budget to spend wisely is in line with what we're thinking, or did the attendance fall off actually scare them into wanting to spend, or does it just scare them into just bringing back Baez to throw the fans a bone and maybe put some more butts in seats? We'll have to wait and see, but hopefully the message was heard loud and clear that fans won't pack Wrigley at those prices for a team, for the product on the field that doesn't match what people are paying to get into the ballpark. It's not 2012 and 2013 anymore. I know we saw that a lot, Pat. We were, the beneficiaries of a lot of those StubHub games.
Yeah, well, I remember back in 2012 and 13 having season tickets and going to games, and it's no fun to pay for tickets when your team is terrible, but I mean, they've more than doubled in price since that time. So, it's getting harder and harder to justify for a lot of people. Is it really worth it? And it's really drudgery is what it is. But I got a little positive note for you. Can I give you my stat of the week?
Let's do that, and then we will we'll let Jared go, and then we'll close out the show with a little Cubs history here, this day in Cubs history. So go ahead, give us a stat, and then we'll wrap it up.
Cubs, these are home run totals by Cubs players this year. 31, 28, 25, 25, 21, 21, 18, 13, 11, and 11. If I had told you at the beginning of the season that was going to happen, you probably would have been pretty excited. And in fact, the Cubs hit, I think, the 5th most home runs they've ever hit in a season this year. Sadly, it didn't really matter. But they had a lot of power for what it's worth. So there you go.
Yikes. That's why run differential is a stat.
Yeah.
Right. Lots of power, right. But you're giving up 7-8 runs a game. So
well, that's the flip side. Yeah. I mean, if you guys want to be downers about it, yeah. I mean, technically true, right?
All right. Well, with that, Jared, we want to thank you for being a part of this podcast all season long. Every single month you came on, helped us break down all the news, helped us cover this team even when it was tough to do so. So thank you, sir. It has been an absolute pleasure. Please remind our listeners how they can subscribe to your newsletter, follow you on Twitter, etc.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, just, I always enjoy coming on and talking Cubs baseball, even when things are not going well. So, but yeah, come find me on Twitter at jwillis, at JWYLLYS. And then I do have a link there in my bio to the newsletter that you can subscribe to. It's free. It's in your email every other Monday. Just some thoughts about like baseball and life a little bit. And I like to link things I've written lately. And then I like also to share stuff that I'm just enjoying, stuff that's, I've read that I liked or watched or just that amused me. Like I came across this thing for this week's issue about, Mick Jagger walked into a dive bar in North Carolina a while back and no one noticed him. No one realized it was him. So, sometimes it's stuff like that. It just put a smile on my face, made me laugh. So I share things like that too.
Excellent. It's always great stuff. And it's always great stuff when you join us on the podcast, Jared. So again, thanks for being part of the show this season. It's been a blast.
Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for bearing with us.
All right, Pat, we only have 3 hours left to talk about the Barstool guy confronting John Cusack at the White Sox game.
And yet we're not going to use any of our precious minutes doing that.
Oh, that's okay. I guess everyone else has already covered that. So I guess we'll scrap those 3 hours and instead we'll talk about this day in Cubs history.
Sure. Well, today's day in Cubs history dates back to 5 years ago, October 11th, 2016. You may recall we were in attendance earlier that week to watch the Cubs beat the San Francisco Giants. Javier Baez hit the home run off Johnny Cueto. The Cubs took a commanding 2-0 lead. And then something weird happened. They went to San Francisco and they lost the first game, and they were losing the second game 5-2 head into the ninth inning. And now we were starting to sweat bullets because those 5-game series, like we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, those are tough, especially when you're the team that wins all the games and you're playing the team that hasn't won a lot of games. It seems unfair very quickly, doesn't it? When you're confronted with this existential crisis of potentially being knocked out in the first round of the playoffs. But Cubs in San Francisco that night against John Lackey against Matt Moore. It should have been an advantage for the Cubs. Matt Moore, of course, pitched out of his mind, gave up 8 innings and into the ninth, just pitched quite well. On the other hand, John Lackey got lit up, Justin Grimm did, and the Cubs found themselves trailing this game 5-2. But then in the ninth inning, and you may recall this because I certainly do, something very unusual happened. The Cubs had probably the most dramatic comeback where they were losing, not Game 7 of the World Series where they weren't losing, but felt like it, but where they were actually losing. And in the ninth inning, your friend Chris Bryant led off with a base hit. Anthony Rizzo drew a walk. Ben Zobrist with a big double scored a run, moved Bryant to third. Wilson Contreras had a base hit, scored 2 runs, and all of a sudden the game was tied. And then Javi Baez got a base hit and drove in Jason Hayward and gave the Cubs put up 4 runs that inning to take a 6-5 lead. And the part that most people don't remember is in the bottom of the ninth, none other than Aroldis Chapman. There's always that question, well, did the Cubs win the World Series because of Chapman or not? Should they have traded Gleyber Torres? Could they have won without him? And people point to that Game 5 of the World Series when he got the last 7 guys out and was, a huge factor. But what people tend to forget, I think, is that in the bottom of the ninth against the Giants, Aroldis Chapman in that game struck out the side on 12 pitches, which is what could be more Cub-like than to score 4 runs in the top of the inning to take this dramatic 1-run lead and then just to cough it up in the bottom of the ninth, right? But he did not. He was lights out, aces, and the Cubs won. thankfully, and got out of that series, because that was a unusually good Giants team for a short series. Just the way they were constructed as a team. So the Cubs were able to escape, and then they got to play the Dodgers, and the rest is history.
And it was kind of the coming out party for Baez, right? So like everybody knew about the Bryant and the Rizzo, and you had, kind of the, and we've got Javi Baez too, guys.
Yeah,
like,
don't forget him.
Don't forget this guy can hit the big home run off of Cueto. This guy can get the big hit here on the road in San Francisco. And that absolutely was, and what a huge, what a huge factor professional hitter Ben Zobrist was too. I mean, that's this guy, 2015, it was a very similar sound to 2021 here, where it's like, oh, you need a guy who can hit for contact and can be a professional hitter and can get up and get the big hits. Zobrist was exactly that guy, and he was exactly what the Cubs needed after that 2015 season.
Yeah.
And just to hear that, oh yeah, he came through with this huge hit and scored a run in the ninth. Like, of course he did. He was so good.
And you know how the Cubs scored their first run of that game? None other than one David Ross with a solo home run.
That's right.
Something that he would repeat later in the playoffs. So good for him when your backup catcher gets big home runs. But yeah, that was a really tough matchup, because Matt